Good afternoon. The Senate Finance Committee is in session, and we're starting today with a fiscal briefing from the Department of Legislative Services. And the analyst who will be providing us with our briefing is David Romans. And so, Mr. Romans, you're on.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and share our document on the screen so you can follow along. The document is very long. I'm just going to hit kind of some highlights, and I'm happy to try to answer any questions that committee members have.
Thank you.
Big picture wise, the state is in probably the best financial condition it's been in probably in any of our memories. We entered the session with a surplus in the current fiscal year of about $4 billion in general funds, which allowed the governor, as you'll see, to do three things together that you don't see happen very often. So put a substantial amount of money into savings, reduce taxes, and make significant spending enhancements in some areas. So if you look at the top of the page there, it's just a chart that shows the budget growth. And overall, all funds, the budget actually declines by about 3.6 billion or 6%. The reason for that is that we received an extraordinary amount of federal stimulus money last year, and that money is beginning to dissipate as the state spends it, and some of it, some of the entitlement enhancements go away. So in fiscal 23, federal funds actually dropped nearly $8 billion, or 31%. So that masks the really dramatic growth you can see there in general funds, second line of $4.6 billion, or over almost 22% actually. So within that 4.6 billion, the governor is appropriating 2.4 billion to the rainy day fund. So he's appropriating money to a savings account. If you take that money out, the true growth in spending going out the door is about 13% growth. While referencing the rainy day fund, I should mention the governor is leaving 3.6 billion in the rainy day fund. So under his plan, 16% of general fund revenues essentially would be held in the rainy day fund at the end of fiscal 23. In addition, he leaves a general fund balance of almost 600 million. So it's about $4.2 billion preserved for the future as part of the governor's plan. I should note on the federal funds that the one thing that is not in the budget in terms of federal funds is that Congress passed the federal infrastructure bill a few months back. None of the money from that bill has been reflected in this budget, and that's largely because the guidance from the federal agencies and even the determination of how much money will come to Maryland from some of the programs has not been made yet. So the administration is waiting for further information, but Maryland will receive about $3 billion in new sort of enhanced funding as a result of that infrastructure legislation. So at some point during the session or the next couple of years, we should see that money flow through the state budget. We can go to the next slide. All right, so one of the key elements of the governor's proposal is tax relief. And there's three components of that highlighted in that little chart on page 2. The most substantial is phasing out the income tax for retirees. And the governor does that starting in fiscal 23 and it is fully phased in fiscal 2028. His estimates are that we would lose about 188 million of revenue in fiscal 23 and then 730 million in fiscal 27. He didn't provide a fiscal 28 estimate, but it will be larger than that 730 million. So that's the big component of the tax relief. The second part is to do away with business filing fees for people who file online. Most people are paying a fee of about $300. These are kind of rough estimates. I mean, it depends on the behavior of people, whether they switch to online filing, but it's estimated that revenues will go down to about 36 million in the upcoming year and about 48 million by fiscal 27. Then last session in the Relief Act, you all enhanced the earned income tax credit for a 3-year period, tax year 2020 to tax year 2022. The governor is proposing to extend that permanently. So it would kick in fiscal 24 in terms of fiscal impact. And that reduces general fund revenues in the out years by about $160 million a year. So all told, by fiscal 27, the governor estimates that his package would reduce revenues by about $942 million. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so what does that mean for the state budget? Can we afford to do that? So we take two different looks at that in this chart. So first, that solid black line is the structural balance. So structural meaning ongoing revenues when it's balanced exceed ongoing spending before the governor's tax plan under his estimates. So he assumes over 500 million structural surplus in fiscal 23, growing to more than $1 billion by fiscal 27. And then the blue bars show you, after incorporating the governor's tax relief proposals, what the structural budget looks like. And you can see the governor believes that his plan is structurally balanced throughout, leaving a balance of over $240 million in fiscal 27. Legislative services, you can see the gray bars there, has slightly different estimates, or significantly different in 27 from the governor. And the primary reason that we differ in fiscal 27 is we think that the forecast that the governor presented understates K through 12 education spending pretty much every year. And it doesn't really start showing up until fiscal 27 because we have a huge surplus in our Blueprint Fund, which was created to help support the rollout of the Kirwan Fund. So for the first few years, we just spend down that surplus in the Blueprint Fund. It doesn't impact general fund expenditures. But by fiscal 27, we'll have exhausted all the surplus in the Blueprint Fund, and general funds will need to pick up a lot of K through 12 costs. And that's why we believe there will be a structural deficit under his plan with the tax relief starting in fiscal 27. And it would likely get worse in fiscal 28 for two reasons. One, the Kirwan costs grow in 28 as we continue to roll the program out. And two, because fiscal 28 is the final year of the phase in of the retirement income proposal from the governor. So it'll further reduce general fund revenues. Let's go on to slide 4. All right, so one of the other things I wanted to talk about is, so I mentioned at the beginning, we entered this session with a $4 billion cash surplus, kind of a one-time surplus, if you will, in the current year. And we wanted to give you a sense of what did the governor do with that one-time money? The biggest component he put into the rainy day fund, about $2.4 billion. Another 300 million or so he saved and put into the general fund. He spends a little over 300 million on sort of one-time operating expenses across fiscal 22 and 23. The biggest of those being the salary enhancements for providers as state employees this month in fiscal 22. So a lot of the costs of those bonuses and COLAs and increments for this first year are funded out of the cash balance. The biggest use in terms of really spending the money that the governor makes of the surplus is to spend over $900 million on PAYGO capital, so enhancing our capital program on top of the general obligation bonds that we sell each year. Now, starting on the lower part of page 4, we just highlight with some bullets there some of the key components, the things that are funded in this budget. First off, K through 12 education. The budget for education aid grows by about 260 million, 3.5%. For the most part, the governor has funded all of the mandates. The one area that you may have already heard about that is not funded in the budget is what is called the Education Effort Adjustment, which is part of the Kirwan bill. And it tries to help out jurisdictions that have to put in a lot of money to meet their local effort, but don't have a particularly large tax bases. The governor didn't fund that, and that means that Baltimore City gets 99 million less than they would have if it was funded, and Prince George's County about 26.5 million less. They're the only two jurisdictions impacted by that not being funded. In the healthcare area, there were a number of mandated health provider rate increases for this year, from developmental disabilities to behavioral health to many of the Medicaid providers. All of those are funded as required in law. And generally that's about 3.25% to 4%, depending on the provider type. And then the governor is funding Medicaid physician rates and 100% of what Medicare pays. Traditionally, we've funded it at closer to 93%, so it's an enhancement in terms of payments to physicians. And in addition, he's put in about 20 million, I believe it is, for an increase in dental rates to, again, try to provide better access for the Medicaid population. In terms of public safety, the perhaps biggest item is that the governor has added about $48 million for the police aid formula. So this is sort of discretionary on top of what was required for this year. It's also notable that he included in that 48 million, about 8 million for Baltimore City. The city does not usually receive money through the police aid formula, so it really, his enhancement covers all jurisdictions. In terms of childcare, the governor's added $50 million to the current year's budget for stabilization grants to childcare providers. This is on top of hundreds of millions that are available from the federal government for that purpose, and the State Department of Education has been giving that money out. They gave out the first wave of that money in October. I'd also note, particularly relevant to the health department, there's over $100 million of new money in the budget for cybersecurity. And obviously, given the issues the health department has experienced this past year, it makes sense for the state to try to enhance its cybersecurity efforts. Let's go to the next slide. I just hit a few more highlights here. Higher education is a big beneficiary of spending growth. The University System of Maryland sees a 19% increase in state support of almost $300 million. Morgan State University receives a $33 million increase, which is about 28%. And then St. Mary's College gets about a 6% increase. Their funding comes through a formula, so it's a little bit less discretionary. Also benefiting in the higher ed world is our community colleges and the non-public higher education institutions that get money through the state's Selinger formula. Those formulas both run off of the amount of aid per student at the public 4 years. So since there's such a dramatic increase at the public 4 years, the community colleges and the private colleges also benefit. So community colleges will get 59 million of new money, about a 19% increase. And the non-public higher education institutions receive about a 30 million increase, about 34% growth. There's also almost 15 million of new money for educational excellence scholarships, expanding that program. The other big operating budget initiative in the budget is trying to bolster state employee compensation. Across fiscal 22 and 23, the governor provides 832 million of funding to boost state salaries. And each bargaining unit reached its own agreement with the state, but generally what's happening is in the current year, employees are going to get somewhere between $1,000 and $1,500 as a bonus. And then most employees will get a 1% COLA. The Ask Me members will get 2%. And then almost all employees will get an employee increment, which is kind of like a merit increase in the current year. And then again, in fiscal 23, come July, there's a 3% COLA for most employees and an employee increment, another roughly 2% on top of that. Again, it does vary by bargaining unit. For example, the law enforcement officers get a much more significant increase in fiscal 23, but generally the numbers I talked about is what most employees will receive. I'll make one reference or two references to the capital budget. One is the governor did set aside 50 million for the General Assembly to allocate for legislative initiatives. It's also notable, probably the big area of funding in the capital budget is he set aside 520 million for public school construction. That's from general obligation bonds and some cash. And then that will, of course, be supplemented through the Built to Learn Act that you all passed last year that allows us to sell revenue bonds to support school construction. There's about a 480 million assumed will be sold this year. So all told, about $1 billion for school construction in fiscal 23. All right, at the bottom of page 5, I'm just going to hit on a couple of kind of the big issues I think the General Assembly is going to be dealing with in the fiscal world this year. The first clearly is, addressing the governor's tax relief proposals and evaluating those. The second is kind of figuring out what is the right balance between tax relief, spending enhancements, and savings. The governor, as you saw, put a lot of money into savings. Is that where the General Assembly wants to be? Are you comfortable with the level of tax relief? So sort of sorting that, the balance between those three things out is going to be a big issue. Let's go to the next slide. A couple of other big issues is that, as I mentioned, is this underfunding of the Kerwin program, that effort adjustment that affects the city and Prince George's County. And that'll obviously get a lot of attention. It's also worth noting that there's about 14 million of other Kerwin-related initiatives that were discretionary. They were not mandates. And the governor chose not to fund them. And they're all listed in that chart in the middle of page 6. How that federal infrastructure money gets spent will likely be an issue. And I think finally, the sort of the sustainability of the Blueprint Fund to support the Kerwin rollout will be an issue. One thing that you all might be interested in terms of Medicaid is just before the governor's budget was released, the federal government extended the national emergency declaration related to COVID. And by doing so, they extended by 3 months, the number of months we will get enhanced Medicaid match. We get an extra 6% of our Medicaid costs covered by the federal government while that emergency declaration is in place. The budget had already been put together. It didn't anticipate that. So what it means is there's about 100 million of general fund savings versus what's actually in the budgets. There's a surplus of 100 million in the Medicaid budget in general funds. So that could be reduced, or you could, the budget committees could try to sort of fence that money off to repurpose it for other, Medicaid priorities. Finally, just state employment has become a problem, and some agencies were having trouble hiring before the pandemic, but in the current employment environment where, private sector as well is really struggling to fill positions, the state has reached a point where almost every agency has more than 10% of its positions vacant. I believe in the health department, it approaches about 13%. The question is, are the salary enhancements the governor has proposed enough to sort of make the state more competitive in the current environment, or are there other things, both monetary and otherwise, the state could do to try to improve the hiring and retention process? I think that certainly the budget committees will be taking a close look at those issues. So Madam Chair, that's sort of the high level overview of the budget. I am more than happy to try to answer any questions you or the members of the committee have.
Okay, I'll start with one and then we'll see what other members want. Is there any significant funding, significant broadband funding for the areas of the state that need it, both for virtual education as well as for jobs, with more jobs going virtual?
Yes, so last session with all the federal American Rescue Plan money that came in, the governor and the legislature agreed to set aside 300 million of that money for broadband, and that was over a multi-year period. Only a little bit of it got spent in the current year, so that money remains available, and the governor's added another 100 million on top of that. So the state is putting 400 million into trying to improve broadband access statewide, which includes providing some subsidies to lower income people who may have trouble affording it, even if it's available in their community. So that's sort of where the budget's
like that much, considering all in northern Baltimore County on the eastern shore, a lot of parts of Baltimore City, you don't have anything. And so it really is a drag on the economy, and it, I think, cost us a lot for the kids. All right, colleagues, raise your hand if you have a question or a comment. Yeah, Senator Battle, and then Senator Kramer.
Senator Kramer, I thought you'd be first, but this is a quick question. David, thank you for the presentation. It's always eye-opening. What is going to be considered retiree income? Is it just pensions? Is it Social Security? Is it IRAs? What's considered retirement income?
It appeared the bill just came in the other day, and it looks like it basically exempts all income for retirees unless they're working full time. But not just pension and those sort of things, but all of their income.
So even return on investments that you
Correct.
might have. Okay, thank you for that. Surprise, thank you.
I guess we're trying to keep him from going to Florida. Okay, Senator Kramer.
Thanks, Madam Chair. David, quick question. What again is the increase in revenue going to the University of Maryland system? What are they getting? It was 280 some million. What is that?
299 million.
299 million increase.
Correct.
In funds to the University of Maryland system. So what is it in total that the university system will be receiving this year in the budget?
I think it's about $1.5 billion. I can send you the precise number. I don't have that in front of me, but about
But
1.5
approximately, you could work with 1.5 billion and be kind of comfortable.
Yeah.
Okay, and that includes
Is any of that
155
money
million?
targeted toward the HBCUs in the system?
Yes, all of the HBCUs receive increase. I mean, all of the institutions receive more than 12% growth. Also included in that number is the sort of first round of money from the settlement that the state reached with the HBCUs. So that is part of that's incorporated into the growth.
Okay, other questions? Well, I don't see more hands, so we really appreciate your briefing. And you're making us a little smarter. And now you're giving us kind of a roadmap so we can read the document that you've provided a little more easily and figure out what else we need to know. Is there anything else you think we ought to be asking? Is there anything that you're afraid we're going to be shocked at if we do it as bedtime reading?
I hope not. I don't think so.
Okay. All right. Well, Mr. Romans is a good person maybe for you to get back to if you have further questions, and we appreciate very much your giving us this overview.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay. Now, colleagues, you know that at 2 o'clock, we've got bill hearings, and we got a lot of people signed up, and then we've got voting. So be on time. Thank you.